Hi everyone. Today, Sarah and I are going to talk about one of my favorite topics of all time, which is astrology. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, I'm excited about this one.
Yeah, I'm really glad that we're gonna talk about it because this is not exactly the kind of subject that's talked about within non-dual circle. In fact, it's probably not just frowned upon, but like completely sort of dismissed. Which I kind of understand. I do understand the reasons why, but of course I'm going to be super biased because I actually think that astrology is one of the most incredible tools when it comes to the journey of awakening, and specifically the inquiry into our patterns and wounds and shadow work and all sorts of things, whereby, you know, we can kind of wander and dig for these things. And astrology provides a sort of like almost like a map. Well, there you go. You can look at it, and here's your blueprint, and here we can start to explore this stuff. So obviously, some of you might know that I am astrologer, and I work with people using astrology as a tool for inquiry into those things. And it's one of my favorite things to do. But Sarah is one of the first people from within so-called non-dual circles who is also into astrology, which is why literally first person that's in the interested in or first person to talk about awakening and also using and really enjoying doing astrology. And so I was just so glad that we could sit down, that I could finally sit down with someone who, doesn't see any conflict between the two whatsoever. And so I wanted to ask Sarah today to talk to us a little bit about how she came across astrology and how the astrology works for her in the context of her journey of awakening. So, Sarah, you can start whatever you feel like starting.
Yeah, we were asking that. I'm like, when did I first come across astrology? Because
Mm,
it's been a handful of years. And my relationship to astrology has evolved and changed a lot over time. So I think it's probably been about 5 years, I think, since I first discovered like in more depth astrology. Because, we all
mm-hmm,
kind of come across our sun sign or something like that in pop astrology. But I think I got my first reading about 5 years ago, and it was like a real, like, someone who knew their stuff, and I could feel intuitively like the power of what they were saying. But I think I still have the recording of that reading, and I remembered listening back to it maybe a year ago or so, something like that. And I was moving through a lot of just processing different emotions, my own
mm-hmm,
traumas, my history, karmas. And so when she was talking about, yeah, this like basically a karmic map of my life,
mm-hmm,
it brought up so much. To me, it felt like just like any other intuitive practice, like looking deeply into myself and the things, the patterns and karmic cycles and
mm-hmm,
ancestral, familial, personal things that were going on in my life. And I was sorting out a lot of that stuff at that time, especially like it's like as we're hitting COVID and that kind of period, I guess, like I was diving into a lot of shadow work and um yeah, so I felt, I guess my first exposure to astrology was helping me dive into my shadows, into like patterns and into like why why I was stuck in certain dynamics
mm-hmm,
um in a deeper way, in a way that felt like I could maybe more directly look straight into things at that time. And yeah, and I felt like maybe just like any other space where someone's kind of like holding a space and like trying to reflect questions to you. Like it felt like another place, another modality to do that. Um, but yeah, over time, I kind of like set that aside a little bit, did other modalities, and then got really into human design. That was like
Mm-hmm.
really like nerded out on human design, which includes or integrates astrology among other lineages and other modalities. And I think that sent me into a deeper dive of the astrology again
Mm-hmm.
because the planets were all integrated into the human design chart.
Mm-hmm.
Then when I dove back into astrology, I came into Hellenistic astrology, which is the ancient astrology, sort of
Mm-hmm.
like the OG astrology. And that just felt like it resonated so much more than the Western or the sort of pop psychology like type of astrology.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, and we could chat about that, but basically I think the ancient astrology to me, um, it connects more to like uh, both like the mythology and like sort of the archetypal um basis of astrology, but also how it connects into the deep like um the deeper questions of the soul, like in a I don't know, it felt to me like just a more like profound and um direct way than some of the stuff today in astrology felt a little bit more on the surface. Um
Yeah. Yeah.
Hellenistic astrology. So yeah.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I'm the first one. People might be surprised given that I'm now an astrologer, but like I was really dismissive of astrology most of my life, even though, of course, now I realize that I actually didn't have a clue what astrology was. You know what I mean? My idea of astrology was sort of magazine horoscopes, the sort of, the little horoscopes written in magazines. Like you said, pop astrology, things like, sun signs, very personality, just like the personality sort of oriented and everything. So I think because one of the things that I wanted to ask you about was how why do you think there's such a dismissal of astrology within non-duality? Um, because I think one of the reasons, without going like too much deeply into that, at least the way I see it, is precisely because astrology is not really understood. So it's almost like dismissed without actually being understood, and going by the sort of first impression, because yeah, if it's only sort of seen as like focus on identity and nothing else, then I can totally understand why there is a sort of objection to that within the context of awakening. But again, I think that's because that's just one facet of looking at astrology, which to me that's like the least in like the personality is like the least interesting stuff for me personally when it comes to astrology. So I just wanted to hear you talk about your thoughts on that, specifically astrology within non-duality.
Yeah. Yeah, I think yeah, there are different types of astrology. Some of it, like we're mentioning, is more like psychologically oriented and personality oriented. So if you're someone in the non-dual space who maybe doesn't want to buy into or believe in the personal self, then you're of course going to be like, that's just bullshit. Like put that
Mm-hmm.
aside. But then there's also, I think, in that same, you can also be exploring and embodying non-duality and be interested in the personality. So and just like how we use personality in our everyday lives and like the parts of us that are still conditioned. And we've talked about this at length. So tune into our other episodes if you're interested in that kind of conversation. So just because you're realizing non-duality doesn't mean the personality necessarily has to be totally irrelevant. So I
Mm-hmm.
don't even think that astrology needs to be discarded, even if it's only addressing personality, right? It's like still useful if you're in the world as a personality. I think
Mm-hmm.
even the most awakened teachers, we all see they have a personality of some kind. Like
Yes.
whether it's that they're more soft spoken or they use certain vocabulary, they grew up in a certain region of the world, so they talk a certain way. Everyone's got a certain, you know, flavor to who they are as a
Mm-hmm.
human. Um, but then yeah, there's also more like for me, if you want to align a bit more on well, like what we think of as non-dual practices. Um, I don't see the problem because it's like, because a lot of non-duality is about contemplation or inquiry, right? Like the practices are like asking a question, like, who am I? Who am I? Who am I?
Mm-hmm.
But like a lot of teachers say, you could ask literally any question. Like it could be a nonsense question, but just keep asking. If it feels meaningful to you to use that question, um, then you could go all the way with that question. For some people, it's who am I? For other people, it's like, what is this? Or what is sound? Or, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I found for me that a lot of tools that were more like contemplative, like even like we've talked about the books for the last like handful of conversations, we were talking about how books can be like a contemplative practice. Like you can sit with a book and like reflect upon it. Um, and same with like, yeah, like a koan in Zen Buddhism. And I see like astrology is the same thing in human design or any of the systems like that. If you use it literally, like imagine it as a mirror and you use it as a contemplation tool, like in sort of like, what is this? Like if I look at my sun, moon, and rising sign and use it to sit with, not as a belief, not as like, this is who I am and I'm believing this to be who I am, but instead as this, um, a finger pointing to the moon, like it's what is this? What is it to sit with the question of like, what does it mean to have a Taurus moon or what it like, and to use that mirror to see things in myself I couldn't see without asking those questions, right? Because there's certain things that like we just don't see about ourselves because they're
Yes.
unconscious and they're subconscious. So either someone in our life has to point it out and be like, hey,
Mm-hmm.
you really need to look at this, or we get into a conflict and we come up against something in ourselves we didn't want to see, or we can proactively look into ourselves, like either like through that mirror, through a contemplative practice, sort of sitting with that and uncovering layers of our own karma, which is like in astrology, I see that you can see your karmic patterns
Mm-hmm.
um, laid out in this wheel format or this like um, this map. But you don't even have to believe that that's your karma in order for it to help unwind. Like I was just thinking about this as we were sitting down. You could literally take someone else's chart. It's not even your chart, and use it as a contemplative practice and ask the same questions. Like I'm not a Sagittarius moon, but if I were to sit with that question about like how do I see this in myself, or what is it to be a Sagittarius moon, I
Mm-hmm.
could get some really rich stuff out of that, just by using that as a contemplation.
Mm-hmm.
And so just with the knowing that we all have infinity, like infinite possibilities inside of us, um, I don't think it matters as much. Yeah, like what we are in our charts, as much
Yeah.
as what it unlocks in us when we ask questions about it, right? So I don't believe in my chart in like because it I don't really even know what it means at the end of
Yeah.
like,
Ultimately,
yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
ultimately I
Yeah.
don't know. Just like we've
Yeah.
said, like ultimately we don't know anything about anything, but what does it help me with is more interesting to me. Like what does it help me uncover in myself? And is it
Mm.
relevant? Does it feel relevant to use it? And it does to me. Like when I follow transits and astrology too, and I find it gives me great insight and to be able to contemplate those transits and find more depth in everyday moments and be more present to them. I
Yeah.
can't explain exactly why that is at the end of the day, um,
Mm.
but it's useful. So
Someone once explained to me, they said, oh, the non-duality is against astrology because astrology reinforces the separate self, you know? And I thought, and again, I totally get why someone would say that, but it doesn't change the fact that there has to be a separate self to be concerned with being reinforced. Because if you see yourself beyond that, even that whole thing, separate, non-separate, then it really is completely irrelevant. You know what I mean? And so I don't know if that makes sense, but like for me, there's absolutely no, like if there's no separation, there's no need to push against anything. It really isn't a case of like this is right, this is wrong, this is correct, this is incorrect. It's like what's useful? Is it helpful? Like I mean, it really boils down to like the simplest sort of questions like that. And so the way I have two types of people that I'm seeing, people who are not at all interested in awakening. But they're interested in exploring basically where they're stuck. Like you were saying, why am I repeating this pattern with my every relationship? Why am I having this pattern when it comes to money? Why am I having this pattern when it comes to like whatever, right? And so, of course, there is a degree of openness to look at stuff, right? Even though they're not interested in awakening at all. And I'm certainly not there to like on a mission to, to make them want to explore this topic. No, we're just exploring the issue at hand, which is relevant to that person. And that's incredibly wonderful. And that feeling of when there is an insight, and I mean, to me, there is no difference, between um I mean, there's such a value and something so beautiful when we see where we're stuck and it gets unstuck. That we're actually, because both in terms of a person who comes to see me, who's not interested in awakening, and a person who is interested in awakening, we're looking at the same thing. What is true about this? We're really asking the same question, like, what is true? Like, what is actually going on about this particular situation? And that inquiry can go into either just resolving a particular issue and end there. And that can be still incredibly useful. And I have multiple examples of people who, through that inquiry and insights, improved their relationship, improved, whatever situation they were looking at. Or it's an inquiry that can go way deeper beyond that issues, like what's actually even behind that and what's behind that. And, so in that sense, to me, looking at planets, transits, and everything is almost like a portal into something greater than just the issue at hand or whatever. Does that make sense at all?
yeah. Yeah, I mean that's how I see it. It's a portal. Yeah, and I think that's where the difference between yeah, you could approach anything as like I'm going to attach to this thing and create some like more identification with it. Or you can go deeply into that, like going into a planet like your sun sign or whatever it is. And then that can be used as something that opens a door into something
Mm-hmm.
deeper, like you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
So either I could approach, and I guess even the idea of like reducing, I do feel like we maybe need to talk about like reducing us as a being to our sun sign or to your moon sign or any of your signs is what most people associate, I think, astrology
Yes.
with. And so in order to fully unpack this, we have to like clarify that the way I, at least the way I see astrology is that if you have your full chart, you've got way more than just one sign in the chart, right? You've got like all these different planets, and depending on what system you're using, you can have infinite planets and
Yeah.
asteroids and all sorts of things. And I know that when I talk to people about astrology, and I can feel their resistance to it because they've been reduced down to their sun sign or to their top three, you know, their moon, their sun, and their rising, that they're like rejecting astrology because rightfully so, because someone was like, oh, you're this way because you're a Gemini or whatever it is. And then it's usually
Yes.
a judgment that puts you in a box and then reduces you to some kind of really like a one line label. But the way I see it is with all this whole constellation of planets, it's actually an exercise in like really deepening and kind of making more complex what we simplify about ourselves, you know? Like we
Mm-hmm.
think like I think like I'm a good person that does all the right things and all that. I have these beliefs about myself that are already here. But if
Mm-hmm.
I look at my chart and it sort of complicates and untangles a bit and unravels this idea of who I think I am, I have to look a little bit closer because this whole constellation of many planets is telling me something about myself that maybe I've already known. Like we usually already know these things, but we haven't really fully brought it up to the surface of like our
Yes.
consciousness enough to take a really good hard look, enough to really unpack and ask deeper questions. So it's like more like bringing to the surface all of this maybe information that we kind of already have in ourselves, but making like complicating, making more complex what we simplify, how we simplify who we think we are. And in that way, it's like that question of like, who am I? Not that being obvious, like I'm Maggie or I'm Sarah, you know, like not just allowing that to be the answer,
Mm-hmm.
but like almost like refusing to have that simple answer and in insisting on a deeper answer. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think astrology in used that way is the same exercise where you're saying, I'm refusing to just believe that I'm a good, nice person. And
Yeah.
instead, I'm going to explore the complexity of who I am. Not, and you know, like you could do it on the personality level, or you could kind of do it the soul level. Some astrologers are more like soul astrologers and kind of like what are souls up to. Or you could just kind of, you know, you could look at it as like a karmic map of like your karmas. Any way, any level you're looking at it, you're gonna be yeah, kind of pulling that string of the yarn ball and it's gonna start opening things. It's sort of like deconstructing yourself, like but people do an inquiry.
Yeah.
You start pulling the thread and it kind of brings different structures of yourself apart and sort of breaks them into different um yeah, different things that you could look at.
But you
Yeah.
definitely you nailed it. It's exactly what I was trying to get to, which is that when astrology is seen as is reduced to like the sun sign, oh, I'm Cancer, I'm Sagittarius, whatever, and that's the view of astrology that's just reduced to this one thing. Then no wonder, people within like the non-dual circles or whatever to do with awakening, they sort of dismiss it or look down on it. I'm not surprised, because if that's the only view of astrology that you have, then it kind of sounds really lame and sounds sort of very superficial, like you said earlier, so I get that, and I think um that was my first shock with astrology, where I have sun in Cancer, and yet I could never really relate to the descriptions, like the typical descriptions floating around about sun in Cancer. And that was adding to my suspicion of astrology as well, because I was like, of course there were elements that I resonate with, but generally speaking, I would say for the most part, I really couldn't resonate with that. And it wasn't until I had my first birth chart reading, where literally I sat with my jaw on the floor like for an hour, because I couldn't believe that someone could tell me so much about my patterns, my story, my childhood even, things like that, just on the basis of my date of birth, and the time of birth. And that's when I discovered for the first time that I was Sagittarius ascendant. And that's when I learned for the first time how important is the ascendant, or rising sign, which is another word for it. And honestly, when I found out about that, it was like, oh my God, now someone is talking to me and about me, because I could relate to so much in the description of what it means to be Sagittarius ascendant. So that was like the first shock. And that was just this was just one little layer added to my little knowledge of that sun in Cancer. But when we're looking at the whole chart, like you said, it can be a never-ending exploration. I mean, I've been doing astrology for years now, and I can I can look at one planet in a particular sign in my chart, and I continue to see new things after years, right? So it just tells you, like, I mean, how it's not just multi-layered, it's complex. It depends on where we're at in a given moment in life as well, and so on. So I mean, and it's I think what astounds me by astrology is almost how alive it is. I never see it as something that's like a birth chart that's sort of fixed, and you look at it and things are either like this or like that. No, it's literally alive. It's like the creative force in motion, that constantly reveals things if one is willing to look at it. So anyway, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I no, I love that point about anything you look at, you're going to be looking at through your lens of perception.
Mm-hmm.
So, like I was saying, when I first discovered astrology, I was really deep in uncovering patterns and shadow and all that stuff, and that was what I was focused on. And then was switching modalities and types of like astrology that I was looking at. And now I really see like one of the biggest things that I look at in astrology is how we can hold duality and non-duality at the same time. And that it's still to me like one of the best metaphors for that, right? Because you're literally holding this chart, for folks who are maybe not super familiar, it's like,
Mm-hmm.
it's a circular chart that's divided into 12 houses. So it's like a pizza with 12 slices.
Yes.
And And when you look at it, each of the 12 houses have like they're in a pairing of dualities, of opposing signs. And there's a way in which, like, when you're looking at your own planets, or you're looking at um, the current transits, that in order to look at any given sign, you have to look at its opposite as well to really have the full story, to really understand, like, if my sun is in Cancer, then, like, to look at Capricorn as the
Mm-hmm.
opposite sign tells us a lot about what it means to be a sun in Cancer. And so for me to use this, what, there are a lot of different systems for archetypes, like,
Yeah.
in spirituality. It's this essentially like a wheel of archetypes where we can dive into what it means to be this side of this duality, and what it's this side of this duality, and to hold both, and how they inform each other and are essentially just two sides of the same coin, or within each other. Like we've talked about, like the yin and yang, that
Mm-hmm.
there's a bit of the yin that's in the yang, and the yang that's in the yin. And in these signs, they're not separate, right? So no one is a standalone Capricorn or a standalone Cancer. Even if we were to reduce someone just to their sun sign,
Mm-hmm.
you actually can't have that sign without its opposing sign. It's not possible to really, it just doesn't exist in astrology, right? It exists because of the opposing sign, and exists because of the rest of the wheel. So we can take that metaphor to anything, right? Like just um we can't be we can't go through awakening without having been, you know, in the depths of our own just, I was gonna say asleep. I don't know. Asleep feels funny to me to say. But in order to come out of something, we have to be in something. In order
Mm-hmm.
to be, to feel like we're touching into spirit, we have to be human. It's like that to me, it's just a really great metaphor and tool to see that. And then, even in order to look at a whole chart, you have to be in a third perspective, right? There's the two sides of the chart going all the way around. But in order to take in a full chart, you're in another dimension. You're in
Mm-hmm.
the third perspective, looking at the whole thing. And that's another metaphor for kind of the non-dual perspective, right? It's like you're looking at reality and seeing all of it as it is, and even all of its contradictions and the seeming paradoxes and the things that don't seem they can coexist, but they do. And somehow it just is all there. The whole thing, the wholeness of life is there.
Yeah.
And if you can hold the whole chart of an astrology chart, I think that it is kind of a good test of whether or not you have fully relinquished, or how far you are in giving up that resistance to any given aspect of life, because it's reflected in these different archetypes. Not, you know, you can use different modalities to look at that, but that astrology is one of those modalities where you can be like, all right, how about like Scorpio and like destruction and like and violence, or some of the darker sides of some of the signs.
Mm-hmm.
Can you hold that too? Like, where is the resistance to that? You know,
Yeah.
and find that in yourself, as an exploration. Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, and I love it's exactly like when I look at the chart, it's such a beautiful metaphor for what awakening to me is about, which is like looking at these seeming opposites, but without conflict. It's literally the opposites coexisting, the multi-layered, the complexity of our humanness, Like we were laughing that, in one of our conversations where my ex-boyfriend said that he never met a person who is, so compassionate and generous and so selfish at the same time. You know what I mean? And to me, it's like it's precisely about that in the context of awakening, there's no denying of those complexities and of those differences and of those seeming paradoxes. It's like a chart is like a one massive kind of embrace of that. And whether it's looking at astrology or not, it's like I think when we wake up to realizing, who we truly are, then that perspective not only invites, but it makes it easier and way more kind of fascinating to look at the so-called conditioned self, because we're no longer identified with it. We're no longer afraid uh, to look at the shadowy bits and the not so pretty things about ourselves. But from that perspective, it's such a fascinating thing to look at. And I think that with astrology or without astrology, it's just that astrology makes it so um you know it makes it kind of, I think, easier because it already gives you a kind of a map and insight into it versus you having to sit and try to figure it out yourself, although of course that's possible. But the other thing I wanted to say is that I think within non-duality, there's a lot of dismissal of our humanness that I've noticed. Which quite frankly, from where I'm standing, I really cannot understand. Um, because if anything, I see our humanness and life as it is as almost as like a gateway to freedom. It's literally a portal. By meeting, all our parts and the situations that trigger us, the situations that make us suffer, you know, to look at that with curiosity and compassion is literally just like the way, so to speak. It's one of the ways, but it nevertheless is like a portal rather than something that stands in the way of us discovering freedom, if that makes sense. So, again, to me, astrology is just such a beautiful way to use our humanness and our current circumstances, whatever they are, as a way to explore that, to find what's actually going on, and to find the things where we feel stuck and where things are sticky and that sort of thing. So yeah, what do you think, Sarah?
Yeah. Yeah, and for some folks, astrology is just not for them. And
Mm-hmm.
that's like, for some, and maybe also for folks who are more inclined to not be interested in the humanness too,
Mm-hmm.
because I feel like I wonder, I mean, because there is kind of in order to explore an individual birth chart, you might, I guess, inherently have some interest in some of your exploration as an individual, you could say.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, and I think what's cool, what I found is like for a lot of astrologers they're like bridging that sense of that divide between the soul, spirit, and body, and the manifest world. And that's kind of where astrology sits, is in
Mm-hmm.
between those worlds. It's like, um, but for some folks, I guess, like, if non-duality to you means not engaging life and or not engaging your humanness, I could see, yeah, that it maybe wouldn't be useful for you. Uh,
Yes, yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, so maybe that's also just like, and then for some folks who are just more inclined to use astrology as a tool, like me, like for whatever reason, like human design and astrology, those sorts of tools, I loved using them because for me. It's a lot of different archetypes and information that I can nerd out on for like years, like because you're saying like you could go into these systems and never ever find the end of them. It's not like memorizing, the 12 signs and 12 houses and then getting it. That there's this rabbit hole that never ends in the depths
Mm-hmm.
that you go. And for nerdy folks like me, like it just felt like, oh, this is really cool. Like I can go so deep on this thing that helps me see myself in a deeper way as also a practice in solitude, like in the times where I really needed to be alone in my own practices, like doesn't require me to be in conversation asking someone like, what do you think about this about me or whatever. I can just like sit and see things in myself with myself and
Yeah.
that practice. All you can have a reader or you can talk about astrology with friends.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the cool things about it is that like you can sit in your own practice with that. But yeah, it might be that at the end of the day, I wonder if we like were to poll people, like for those folks who find astrology useful and don't, and those
Mm-hmm.
who are more tend towards like this transcendent without integrating the humanness or without embodying that spirit in them their everyday life. Um, there might be some correlation around that. I don't know, but because yeah, there is some like I think we're talking about like to us, like astrology is practical. It's not a belief system. It's not like
Yeah.
something that you just add to a sense of identity or anything like that. It's actually just very pragmatic for living life and for like
Mm-hmm.
having more of a sense of insight and flow into life. Yeah.
Yeah, and totally. I mean, to me, astrology just so we're clear, like I mean, that's it's just like one of many, many tools that are out there and modalities that is basically just providing an insight into our humanness uh in a way that's, for me the most helpful and kind of most kind of clear. But that is not to say that there aren't, you can sit with a great therapist and that will guide you and guide the conversation into certain areas that are sticky for you. So, it's just again, it goes back to what Sarah and I are always saying, which is like you do what works for you. But I like I said at this time, I am just so completely biased about astrology because I just think it's just so rich, it's just so rich. And of course there are all kinds of systems, there are all different kinds of schools of thought around astrology, and there are very different astrologers. So not not every astrologer will have the same attitude, not every astrologer will focus on the same things in the same way. So just like with teachers, just like with anything else, it's important that if you want to explore astrology and you want to look for astrologer, that you find someone who, again, you resonate with, because there are definitely astrologers out there that are maybe great astrologers, but I would definitely not resonate with them, and I couldn't see working with them the way they do. So that is also important, just like with everything else, to find someone. How did you know who to look for when you were looking for a birth chart reading?
Yeah, the first person I found, I resonated with them because they felt like a very intuitive person. It just felt like they weren't just reading a chart. They had a different level of connection to something. And this is goes to for also for depending on who you are and how you see astrology. Some folks see astrology as a divination tool, right?
Mm-hmm.
As it's just like any other divination, literally for many traditions, spiritual traditions, you can see your world, see like a hawk flying through the sky, or seeing like having the synchronicity of something coming into your life, those as like divination, like a way to literally speak and have a conversation with spirit through our world. Um,
Mm-hmm.
you could use like astrology or tarot or whatever you want, but in a lot of like shamanic traditions, it's literally like through nature, through stones, through sticks, or um, and
Mm-hmm.
those are ancient practices, that I think to this day, like, so many people practice these things to get insights into the nature of the soul, into the nature of life. And again, that may not be for everyone, but you can use astrology in that same way. And I think that's more like, in a sense, the way that I was tuning into it at first without knowing it was like wanting to find a reader who was really in tune with their intuition. So they were connecting to this greater sense of knowing that we associate with non-duality, right? Like this
Mm-hmm.
knowing, deep knowing, and then using the chart as a way to kind of organize that knowing and to almost create a container for sharing insights that maybe could have been shared without the chart, like,
Yeah.
but it's a format to share those insights and intuitive senses. And so, yeah, and I think to this day, like the astrologers that I like follow their content or like I connect with the most now are ones that have gone very deep in their spiritual path and have a very intuitive sense that's not textbook. It's not like of the mind.
Yeah.
It's not like they read the full encyclopedia on astrology and they have the
Mm-hmm.
textbook answer memorized. It doesn't have anything to do with that. They're like there are some fundamental principles underneath astrology. Just like you could say, like the I Ching, or like, there's also every indigenous culture has like some divination tool, right? Where it's like if you
Mm-hmm.
know the pattern of the I Ching, right, you know the basic symbology behind it, then when you do a reading, you're you can both tune into the fundamentals, but then the reading is more the intuitive insight that comes through based
Yeah.
on, right? So that's kind of the folks that I connect with because I just feel I resonate more with the intuition side of things, and
Mm-hmm.
not, yeah, for folks who are more into like the textbook mind based, astrology. That is another way of doing it. I find that that's not, yeah, it doesn't connect with me in the sense of like getting to the heart of a deeper truth.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I love the astrologers that what they do is like really complicate and challenge any textbook answers, like the ones that are,
Right.
oh, you think that to be a sun in Aries means this? Well, here's like 5 examples of contradictory things to that,
Yes, yes,
you
yes,
know,
yes.
to like it's almost like the folks that have more expansive ways to relate to something, both because maybe they're tuning in to that knowing and that sense of spirit, which doesn't allow for the boxing in of something, but also like through life experience, if you've lived a life where you've seen how you can't oversimplify, you
Mm-hmm.
start to like just in your explanation of things or how you share, start holding multiple truths at the same time, right? You start sharing that way. And I think that's kind of what I can, yeah, relate to at this point. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like with, as I'm not a big fan of any kind of dogmatism and the only way and the only correct way. And there's a lot of that going on within astrology as well, just like within any area. So, for example, I would not resonate with or even look for astrologers who are dogmatic that way. And by that, I mostly mean where they work within one system and they bash any other system, because, you know, it's not their worldview or whatever. So that is something that I avoid within any area of life, whether it's spiritual teachers or astrologers or whatever. I definitely avoid this, but yeah, I'm the same. And it's kind of interesting as I was listening to you. Like, for example, I have Saturn in Virgo, in the 10th house. And if you went by the book, like the kind of typical description of Saturn in Virgo in the 10th house, literally there's nothing that resonates. Like I can't find examples of that in my life. Right? And it would have been so easy to say, oh, well, that's bullshit then. You know what I mean? It would be so easy to dismiss that because that's not true for me. But then you go to a different astrologer who's perhaps more intuitive and like really dug deeper into a particular archetype or particular planet or particular sign, and he'll be able to tell you what that specific Saturn in Virgo means in your case. Like if this doesn't resonate, then let's explore that further. Let's dig deeper and see what that specifically means to you so that you can find it, helpful and so on.
Yeah, well, I think we've chatted a little bit about how I see like we're all mirrors to each other generally. So imagine
Mm-hmm.
if you have different astrologers who are mirrors and they're like mirrors that have a bit more depth of the questions or things that they can
Yep.
reflect, right? So it's like anyone in your life is a mirror to showing what is inside. But if someone has pointed questions about the beginning of your childhood based on your birth chart, that, it's a really helpful mirror. And yeah, and I have had, I'm thinking about too, I've had astrology readings from folks where it didn't land and it didn't connect, but I can see now because I've studied astrology for a while where they were reading um and kind of speaking to a placement without seeing like the symbology or the archetype was actually playing out in a different way in my life. Like the archetype was true, like how it was placed in my life. Like, for example, this one guy did my chart and was saying something about like one of my parents having a certain type of role in my life. And I was like, well, that's not really true. But when I looked deeper into the chart and saw what he was seeing, actually it was the other parent in my life that had that role. And
Right.
and if he had, instead of assuming like, oh, this must be this parent doing this because of this way that he was reading the chart,
Mm-hmm.
instead, if he had opened the question of like, how, do parents, relate to this in this particular way, um, keeping it open in that exploration, then the archetype in the chart related perfectly to my childhood. So it was interesting. So it's like, that can be one of the reasons why, yeah, we say that we don't really connect to
Mm-hmm.
astrology is because whenever it's a bit too boxed in, and it's too particular to this one placement, then it's not a whole story or a whole expression of all these different dynamics that have all these different potentials. That if you
Mm-hmm.
see that like every single placement has 20 different potential expressions,
Yeah.
probably like a million, actually
Yeah.
infinite expressions, but it has maybe the flavor of this archetype then, and it's in interaction with all these different placements, then there's so much more that can be gained from that conversation
Mm-hmm.
and from exploring it. And you can sit with each of those placements or the reading with so much more depth, um, that you can find, whatever you're needing to find out of it. Again, it's not like needing to believe the system of astrology in terms of like, oh, is this true? Is it accurate? It's more like,
Yes.
what in the astrology is helping me see something in myself?
Yeah.
And how is that a useful, practical thing, um, for life?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I feel like that's just out of any tools, they use on the path, like, is it getting you anywhere?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's such a good question. Like, is it helpful? It just
Yeah.
very simply forget about do you believe, you don't believe it. Is it helpful? Is the session with the astrologer provided some kind of insight or guidance or something new, that a different way to look at it? Which is why, to me, this is not the case of like right or wrong astrologer. It's just an astrologer that speaks to you. Is the astrologer or the type of astrology that resonates with you? That's to me like the only thing to care about here, because there's another thing which is, and that happened to me quite a few times, where let's say I looked at somebody's transits and they would be like current transit. So basically what I mean by that is basically what's going on planetary, uh at at the current in your current situation, as opposed to looking at your birth chart. um and people will be like, I'm not sure, that doesn't resonate. And then I would get an email from them in like 2 weeks or like a month, and they'll say, oh my God, I didn't see it at the time, but that totally played out. Or, we would explore a birth chart and talk about a particular pattern that wouldn't resonate with them at the moment, but then they would let me know that actually they had a lot of resistance to actually seeing this particular pattern. So they kind of dismissed it as like, no, it doesn't resonate, whatever, or it's not true. And it was only after a while that they realized, oh, okay. And that happened to me as well. There are things, my very first reading with astrologer was also like that. I literally laughed at certain things he said because they just felt so completely far off and like not relating to anything to do with my life at all. And then they turn out to be totally true. So there's also an element of that, right?
Yeah, totally. I've had that as well. And I've had that where I was just starting to see something in myself. And I met with an astrologer, and the things they were speaking to were still raw. I was still like, ugh, yeah, I do see that. I do. Um, and I didn't quite have words yet. I couldn't quite fully, hold that part of myself, but I could see it, for the
Yeah.
first time. And so sometimes, yeah, it's just like being able to acknowledge there's like infinite depth to keep seeing things. And so
Yeah.
every time you revisit, um, a tool like this, you could see deeper and deeper and deeper, or more aspects, like more of the complexity of what it means to be human and to be
Yeah.
spirit as well, or whatever you want to call it, to be all of it, to be whole.
Did you find a particular? I know that you mentioned that Hellenistic astrology was something that resonated with you the most, but did you also try Vedic astrology? You did have a reading with a Vedic astrologer. Can you talk a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, I had a reading with a Vedic astrologer. Uh, I, I got COVID, um, a couple of years back, and I was like, well, what should I do for the week? And I was like, I'll book a reading with a Vedic astrologer. So anyway, it was an interesting like experience to be able to, for me, like when I have a week's worth of rest, mandated. What I just went down a rabbit hole of studying Vedic astrology. Um, so yeah, I've explored it a little bit myself, and then I had a reading, um, and and it was interesting because, I think a lot of traditions, there's connections that go way back, right? Like between ancient Western and
Mm-hmm.
ancient Eastern astrology. We don't know really like where things began and when they were crossed over to different cultures. Um, but in Vedic astrology, it's interesting because the chart is like slightly shifted. So this is what I mean too about like if if you think like, well, like I don't really want to believe in my chart, but you want to use
Mm-hmm.
this as a tool. Literally, Vedic astrology for me, like my sun in Western is in Aries, but in Vedic it's in Pisces. And so it's like it shifts a whole sign, right? And so like my moon then moves from Taurus to Aries. It shifts so much that like those are completely different signs
Yes. Yeah.
for
Yeah.
those planets to be in. But I can see the truth in that chart as well. And again, that doesn't mean that astrology isn't true, because how could it be that, if it's supposed to be true, you're supposed to be this one thing because we believe in this one system that's this one way. And instead of, as we were talking about, if it's a tool to use for inquiry and contemplation, then there are multiple truths. There are different ways. I love one of my favorite astrologers talks about turning the jewel. Um, so when we talk about any given planet, or we talk about any different archetype or placement, you turn the jewel of the reflections that you get from it. So if I move my sun from Aries to Pisces, I can kind of turn the jewel of like, who I think I am,
Mm-hmm.
look at it from a different angle. Like if I look at it from the angle of this, like a fire sign that initiates, that starts things that, you know, um, like you said, like maybe the selfish, compassionate side. And then I turn to this Pisces, which is like water, like mutable. It's just like this sort of flowy thing. Like I can find the truth in both. Like I've been the one that jumps off the cliff, takes the risk, like willing to
Yeah.
start things. Like I've tended to gravitate to leadership and all this stuff. And then I can also see the Pisces part of me, and none of it means that like that's who I am. But it like brings out the insight and reflections on these aspects that express through this body and in mind. And so I think Vedic astrology is a fun thing to explore. And now, if you've already explored Western, to get a different angle of
Totally.
who you think you are, and to maybe complicate and challenge, maybe if you are kind of identified with your Western astrology chart, to look at your Vedic astrology chart will complicate that and maybe actually help you break down beliefs, or yeah, like thought structures around what it means to be XYZ in your Western astrology.
This is an open, curious exploration. This is not about a belief system. This is not about getting hooked on one kind of identity and consumed by it. And it's precise to me. It's precisely the opposite. But I can totally see how astrology or certain types of astrology can take you in the opposite direction. In other words, where I so identify with a particular interpretation of planets or with a particular system or with who you are or who you are not, you know, that when that's questioned and challenged, then it can be really difficult. But that alone is such it might not be nice when we're experiencing this, but it's such a useful thing to explore, you know, especially in the context of awakening. If you identify with any part of yourself as something fixed, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and that's again, I don't know if you are wanting to identify with something and you're
Mm-hmm.
just in this part of life where that's kind of what you need. Like some
Mm-hmm.
there are parts in life when we like need something to hold on to.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it might just be astrology or something else, like
Or
a
something else,
partner.
yeah.
Yeah, like, and so I don't, again, I don't think it's,
Non-duality.
yeah, non-duality. Yeah, sure. Like, I don't think it's necessarily a problem.
Yeah, it could
You
be
know,
anything. Yeah.
it's just, and that's, I think maybe there's a judgment of like the attachment. And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
well, we all have done that. So it's just a part of life. There's times in our lives where we want to attach to things for security,
Yep.
and there's nothing wrong with that. If you want to
Yep.
use astrology that way, use it that way for as long as it feels good to you and it serves you. Just know that it won't, if you want to deepen in the spiritual
Mm-hmm.
path, like at some point you're going to need to let that go, but there's no rush. And if like that's what you need right now, like people use all sorts of other things. They use books to attach onto books, belief
Teachers,
systems, yeah, teachers, spiritual systems, practices, um, meditation,
and
like
that's also very much part of the journey, right? I mean,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. If there's the root of that need to attach within you, you're going to find something to attach to.
Mm.
And what it is, I think, it's like, okay, it might be astrology, might be something else, but it's coming from something else. It's not
Yeah.
astrology causing that
Yes.
attachment.
Yes, yes, yes.
So I think that's the difference of just noticing like it's not astrology putting its claws on someone or something like
Yeah.
that. Like
Yeah.
like the reason why you'll find different astrologers or different people who resonate with you, like inevitably, like if we were to have 100 people on a
Mm.
lineup and ask them, like show them a bunch of astrologers and see which ones they choose, they will choose the ones that are aligned with where they're at in their own personal spiritual development.
Totally.
And it's going to match exactly, if someone's really into shadow work, then that person's going to choose that astrologer who's doing that kind of astrology. If someone's
Mm.
really into transcendent stuff, they're going to find an astrologer that's going to be really into transcendent stuff.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of, again, it's a reflection of what we're up to.
Yeah. I'm the same with everything, you know, like for me, I appreciate the variety so much, you know, that like just like within non-duality, there are different teachers and different perspectives and different approaches and different attitudes. I love that because at different times it serves and you know and then it doesn't serve and then there's something else to choose from, and that's just amazing. And to me with astrology is the same, like even though I use the Hellenistic astrology in terms of like the house system specifically, because I love it so much. I don't know why I resonated with it from the start, but I also explore other schools of thought. So like for example, I love evolutionary astrology, but not all perspectives on evolutionary astrology or not all interpretations within evolutionary astrology. But I love to take bits and pieces from different, whether or like Vedic astrology, you know, there's just like so much to it always goes back to the same question: what's useful in the moment? What piece of knowledge or perspective helps me see something in a new way or with fresh new eyes, and that sort of thing. And I appreciate, um I just see different perspectives as opposed to right or wrong perspectives, is what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe to this reminds me of I'm gonna kind of paraphrase this, but I remember hearing Adyashanti talk about, if we think there's an end to this journey, like, is there really an end to being more kind, being more loving, like being able to fully embody who we like are authentically, all the things that like to be able to completely have we moved past like all of our triggers and traumas, all of the little things that irritate us or come up
Mm-hmm.
and frustrate us in our
Mm-hmm.
days? No, I mean, like even the teachers that maybe say they do, like you see them like on their videos getting frustrated, like it's funny because it's like I'd show me a human that's not human. Um, and if we kind of assume like we have this infinite ability to look within ourselves, even when we've realized certain stages of the journey that seems like there's nothing to be done anymore. There's still an infinite capacity to look deeper and
So right.
still an infinite capacity to uncover whatever that means at that point, when it's like it doesn't feel like there's so much to do, or like even if it feels like the spiritual journey is kind of done and you're like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, like there isn't something to accomplish, but at the same time there's still this infinity within. There's still this infinity within everything. And that journey, like in exploring that, never really ends. And that's what's so beautiful, is that we can just keep going into the beauty of, and like the complexity and the strangeness and the mystery and, um, yeah, and the contradictions and the paradox and the weirdness of what it means to be human. Yeah.
um this is why I like to say that awakening is a verb. It's more like a verb as opposed to like this, like one-off event that sort of happens and then sorts us out. Do you know what I mean? Like we're sorted moving forward. Like I mean, at least not been the case in my experience by far. And actually, the sort of transcendental insights, as incredible and pivotal as they were in that journey, the as pivotal were the parts where I really had to confront the really not comfortable parts of myself. So like the shadowy bits and the long held beliefs about myself, that I just assumed were true and then turned out at least either not be true at all or not quite. Oh, they were not all quite true. And that was difficult. And to me, the astrology is so beautifully can sort of help see those parts. And if you can look at this stuff in a sort of non-judgmental and compassionate way with someone, then and just like be in that space as we explore those parts that we normally don't want to hear or want to try to avoid, then it really is amazing, so whether this is like any kind of childhood wounds or any kind of tendency and repetitive kind of patterns and everything, to me the Berkshire analysis helps sort of makes the unconscious conscious, basically. It's really that. And it's a continuing process. It's like Sarah and I were chatting before we started that there was a year and a half where there seems to be nothing much coming up for me, and then all of a sudden we had a situation that exposed just another layer of a wound that I've already seen. I've seen that particular wound but I've seen a layer of it. And then a situation happened that exposed another layer. And then I looked at my transits and I was like, boom, I could immediately see the transits that corresponded with this particular situation. And that doesn't cease to blow my mind. And my partner is laughing at me because especially when it comes to looking at people's transits, when I'm done with the reading, I'll come to see him and I'll be like, this is mind blowing. It's all there, and I'm like a kid, like even though I've been doing this so much, for such a long time, it just doesn't cease to amaze me how it's all there. It's almost like a gift, to help us understand what's actually going on with us in any moment.
Yeah, I think just if astrology feels like a cool tool to use, then use it. If it doesn't, then don't. Yeah, it's just like anything, and it's becoming more popular in the recent years. I think
Hmm.
what's interesting is, when I think about like when I was younger, people only knew what their sun sign was. And now people know their sun, rising, and moon sign. That's kind of like the more like the go-to question isn't just what's your sun, it's the top three or whatever. And I've
Hmm.
heard even like people apparently that went to my or that go to my college now, that's like one of the questions they use to introduce themselves is like, "Hi, I'm Sarah and I'm a like," and
No
they
way.
introduce, yeah. And I was like, wow. So like just intergenerationally, what I see in that, it's interesting is the continued complexity that like from holding just one sign to three signs, and maybe from three signs or three like planets to five
Hmm.
or maybe
Hmm.
to seven, and moving in that direction is interesting, for the pop culture to be using astrology in more complexity now. And if that's true, then maybe, in time we see like there is actually there's a much more depth potentially to use this tool with. And but again, like wherever you feel called and however you feel called to use it.
There's definitely a new kind of like a renaissance of astrology. I definitely noticed that, and I think with Pluto going to Aquarius, it's just gonna be. I think in like 10 years' time, if someone is not into astrology, that's gonna be like weird. It's like you're not into astrology? What do you mean? You know what I mean? And people
Mhm.
will be speaking that language. It's such a vast area that it's virtually impossible to like. My point is it's virtually impossible to dismiss even astrology because it's so vast and there are so many types. It's not like a homogeneous kind of like a monolith, that's astrology because it's multiple things, multiple areas, multiple perspectives, multiple focuses. So yeah, if anyone feels drawn to exploring it, go for it. And I might even leave some links to maybe some books or channels if you may wish to explore, um, just to start with, and then take it from there, like with everything. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do we have anything else that we want to say about that?
Um, no, have fun exploring. I mean, yeah, I think it's there are certain things that if they light you up and it's it's like a fun exploration, then just like anything, like just enjoy the ride too of it, without needing to figure out anything necessarily. Like that's part of, at least for me, I found like what I enjoy about astrology is just it's fun.
Yeah, it's incredibly fun to explore, and I think one of my favorite parts is the fact that it's alive and it's fresh and it continuously exposes something interesting that I've not seen before, or refused to see it before, or resisted seeing before, you know. And so from that point of view, is just, yeah, it's just one of the many tools for the inquiry, and I just happen to find it to be the most useful. So but yeah, you have to find your own tool and what works for you. All right, guys. So we're gonna see you next week. I have no idea what we're gonna talk about next week, but I'm sure we'll figure it out. And we'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye.
Bye.